And welcome to episode 2 of The Last Sell, where we investigate sales through stories of great salespeople. We have one for you today, Andy Paul. I'm Kevin Hill, one of your hosts, along with Mr. Richie Daigle. Richie, take it away.
Andy's one of my favorite authors of sales books. I like books, Kevin, and my gripe with most sales books is that a third of the stuff, or a third of the book is really good, and 2/3 of it's kind of filler. It's like But Andy Paul's book is different. It's straight. It's to the point. Every page is really good. And his big thing is, hey, be a good human. Like maybe that's the most important thing in sales is to listen to people and help people and be a good person. And let's focus on how to do that, and here's some ways to do that in sales. Super cool conversation. And he's been part of some massive deals. Like some of the deal sizes he was discussing, 8-figure deals, like just wild stories. I mean, he had some really, really cool stories in this episode about navigating multi-million-dollar deals and flying across continents and like all the things that happened. One tactic, which I'm not going to give away, which was fantastic about how to better your odds when you're in a head-to-head situation with somebody else, which I thought was absolutely brilliant. Hint, it involves, accessing your partners and using them strategically. But really cool conversation. What were your big takeaways, Kevin?
Just simplified. I felt after we had a conversation with Andy that I could go out and sell global satellite communications tomorrow. That's how simple he kind of made it and straightforward. So I really appreciate that. But without further ado, let's just jump right into the conversation.
So I think that's a good place to start, Andy. I'm curious, for someone who ran a podcast and is starting a new podcast, what advice do you have for us who, for Kevin and myself, who have also previously ran a podcast and we're here starting a new podcast?
Well, I for me, I don't know if this is advice for the audience or not, but for you in terms of starting a podcast is advice I give to podcasters. Just remember that people tune in to listen to you, and that's where the relationship is built. So just focus on inserting yourself into the conversation, because people ultimately are tuning in to hear your point of view more so than the guests, because that's where the relationship exists. But in terms of other advice, is just find interesting people to talk with. I mean, you've done it before. You did it for 3.5, 4 years. I've done it, for 8 years now, and I find that I always like to say it's sort of one of the more selfish things I've done in my business career, because I probably have talked to 1,000 guests over that period of time. And where else do you get the opportunity to talk to 1,000 smart, interesting people? And I've taken away as much from talking to them as probably the audience has.
I think that's an important point of doing podcasts, and it's something that people overlook who haven't done a podcast, is how much you learn. Mm-hmm. How much you learn from the guests that you talk to is amazing.
Yeah. And I'm a firm believer that, you're going to find really interesting, intriguing thoughts and opinions from all spectrums, people all across the spectrum. And so one of the things I was intentional about with the new podcast I launched in July of this past year, whereas my previous show had done about 1,200 episodes of an interview podcast, which was, as I said, fun and educational and informative, is I just wanted more voices in the conversation. So with this new format podcast, my show, the Win Rate podcast, every episode is me and 3 guests. So I wanted to have as many diverse voices, new voices, not just the same sales authors and, experts and so on, but people who are selling and people who are, from all aspects of the sales and revenue process, not just, I said, authors and bloggers and so on. And it's been great because we have these conversations that bring points of view forward that people maybe don't normally hear. And I think it's so important because I think sales is sort of stuck. It's sort of a recurring theme of mine and what I write and what I talk about is this. technology notwithstanding, we're basically selling and managing sellers pretty much the same way we have for 50 plus years. And we really need to rethink, I think substantial elements of how we go about the business if we want to stay relevant in the process to buyers. And because, they increasingly have options that don't involve talking to salespeople. Not that they're optimal, but they can get the job done. And so I think I said, if we want to make sure that as human sellers, we stay relevant, things have to change.
For sure. And Andy, help us. I mean, there may be people listening that aren't familiar with you. There is I'd say they're few and far between because you've done a great job of getting your name out there. Your book is fantastic. It's one of my
Thank you.
favorite sales books, I have to say. But for those people that may not know you, like just a quick introduction and how you went from where you were in sales to where you are as an author and podcast
Sure.
host and voice in the space.
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, which I sort of lean into these days because, this is my 46th year in sales. So was in the tech biz. Yeah, started off selling large computer systems, on-premise computer systems to companies that, for many of them, is their initial foray into automation and computerization. So just to sort of put a stake in the ground in terms of timing. So one of the things I learned really early on was how do you help the buyer and really focus on that? How do you help them make this decision? Because it was a very monumental decision for companies at that point in time. It was, we've been keeping basically large, accounting systems and job cost accounting systems and so on, selling a lot to the construction industry. And this was a big leap, right? I mean, one that we sort of forget about today. So for me, it really got me in this mindset of, my job really isn't about pushing my products. I really have to help these people make this decision to make this change. It's really, as a decisive change in their business. So did that. I worked at Apple in the very early days of Apple. Worked for a variety of startups up until about year 2000. Spent about 15 years selling large satellite communication systems to large enterprises around the world. So wanted to start my own gig, and my expertise really was, how do you help small, no-name companies, which all these startups were, go and compete against the big guys for big orders and win? And that was why I'd been hired and worked for a variety of succession of startups doing that. So I started my own company, working with, again, small, mid-sized companies specifically on that task. I'd help them learn how to compete and win. And then sort of got the bug to write a book. Sort of in year 2000, 2011, wrote my first book, got the bug for podcasting in 2015, started my podcast. And the podcast got acquired in the year 2000 or 2020, excuse me. And I produced that under contract to the company that acquired the podcast, but then sort of went on my own path earlier this year and started a new one. And didn't anticipate when I wrote my first book that there would be an audience for it. It was more sort of scratching an itch, and turned out people liked it. And so one book led to two, led to three, and now I'm actually hoping 2024 shooting to get my next book published.
Congrats on all of that.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's been fun, right? I think that one of the elements that people miss, and I think it's somewhat nature of the way the business has evolved, is that you don't often hear salespeople talk about having fun. And I had this incredibly fun career and have had this incredibly fun career. And, a number of different chapters. I start off in direct sales. I started selling to the construction industry, these computer systems. And then, got involved at Apple in the early days of Apple in 81, joined Apple. So a couple $100 million company. They're not a, multi-billion-dollar company. So, I got involved in channel sales, which I hadn't, been involved with before. And then got back into direct selling, but selling, I said, satellite communication systems. What do I know about satellite communication systems? I did that for 15 years. for 3 different companies, and yeah, gave me the opportunity to travel the world. You know, I've sold on every continent but Antarctica, dealt with, huge companies that everybody
Yeah.
knows, and it was just fun, right? I mean, we were the underdog. Every by definition, every deal we went into, we were the underdog. And learning to be able to operate in that environment, to be able to um, win, 7, 8, 9-figure deals competing against these mega companies was just a gas. But again, you don't hear people talking about the fun of it because it was so creative. It demanded so much,
Mhm.
creativity and doing things different. And that's said, you're always sort of the underdog. How do you help the buyer, and how do you differentiate yourself? So that part sort of seems to be missing these days, and because it tends to be more about, hey, we've got our process. We want you to comply with our process. This is our playbook. Here are the steps. Let's yada 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 yada. And I think the thing that keeps people in sales, especially the top performers, certainly true in my case, is autonomy.
Mhm.
And that's part of what makes selling fun, is you have the autonomy to say, look, this is my first sales job. Yeah, my boss was very clear. You are the president of this territory, right? You're the CEO. Make your number. Obviously we operate within frameworks and guidelines and so on, but other than that, go make it happen. And having that freedom early in your career to constantly be experimenting and feel like you were in charge of your success is I found that really became important to me as I looked for different jobs as I moved sort of up in my career. That autonomy was really important, and I think it helped me perform at higher levels because I was doing it. I was responsible for my own success. And that's one of the themes I wrote about in my last book, Sell Without Selling Out, is just, you have as a seller, you have to find that situation, demand it even.
Yep. So Andy, I have a couple oddball questions here. I think they're gonna make sense here in just a moment. But
Sure.
of all the places you've traveled and all the vacations you've had, where is your favorite location? If you had to go on one vacation, you only got one left. Where are you going on vacation?
One left. It'd probably be Hawaii. Um, one of the benefits of being on the West Coast for most of my life is Hawaii's pretty close, and it's just a place that speaks to me, I guess. And so, I think I've been. Well, not think I know. I've last time we were there, we counted up over 50 times. So, yeah, and so that's sort of my go-to place.
Hawaii. And then
Yeah.
what's your favorite beverage? Could be anything. What's your favorite drink? Alcoholic or non-alcoholic? Just what do
um,
you?
well, probably water, but when I'm having fun, I enjoy a good beer.
All right. So imagine that it's way into the future. You are sitting on a beach in Hawaii, and there's just beer everywhere. There's beers, coming out of the sand. There's people walking around the beach with beers on trays everywhere. There's beers coming in the waves. There's beers
Sure.
behind you, and you're retired. You are fully retired. You're no longer doing any more work. What is the last thing that you ever sold? What was your last sale?
Myself. So that's my business, right? I mean, if whether it's a consulting project or a coaching project, or I have sponsors for my podcast, selling sponsorships. Ultimately, it's me that I'm selling, um, and it has been for since I started my own company.
So if the last sale, I'll push a little bit deeper. The
Sure.
last sale of you, what is that looking like? Is that a specific coaching job? Is it selling you to a company, or what specifically does that last sale of Andy Paul look like?
That's a good question. Um, I mean, it's hard to at my age, it's hard to predict my horizon. Um, Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. Probably. I'd guess probably sponsorship of the podcast. I imagine. If I think over time I could see myself focusing mostly on that. Um, but yeah, hard to say. I mean, I still am excited about what I do, and still curious about opportunities to spread the word, and that the things that I'm passionate about in terms of sales, in terms of sort of the human first selling, and obviously with the advent of AI in the last year in the form chat generative AI, I yeah I've been energized to say, okay, actually I think that humans have a very central role to play in sales. It might be in a little bit smaller patch in sales, because I think there'll be fewer products that need humans involved in the selling of them, but I still think those are strategic products that are very important to companies. And if we're going to be involved, as I said before, if we're going to be involved, we need to do a better job, and in order to maintain relevance. So as a mission, I still see that as something that I want to be involved with.
I guess if you're in sales, you never really stop selling, do you? Until the day that you die. You're always selling something. Might not be something for money, but you're always selling yourself. You're selling, others around you on whatever idea that you have.
Yeah, I mean, let me put a different spin on that, because I wrote about this in Sell Without Selling Out. Is so what's the job of a salesperson? And so many sellers think, well, my job is to persuade a buyer to purchase my product. And as I wrote about in the book, I don't think that's the job at all. It certainly hasn't been the way I've practiced it, nor do I think it's the way that most top performers do. Instead, I think the job of a seller is to listen to your buyers, understand the things that are most important to them, and then help them get that.
Mm-hmm.
And so this different spin for what you're saying in terms of always sort of selling is that's actually, to me, has always been a life lesson, right? What's my job as a spouse? Well, it's to listen to my spouse, to understand the things that are most important to her, and then help her get those things. What's my job as a colleague? My job is to listen to my colleagues, understand things that are most important to them, and then help them get that. So yeah, to the extent that you follow that path, as I believe we do, sure, you always serve selling, but to me, selling is really, it's a form of helping.
Yeah, and it certainly should be. And I think that's where the point that you made earlier, sales organizations are sometimes run like in the same way they've been ran for 50 years. And you get into helping buyers buy, or I guess that would be a way to say it, right? Helping buyers buy versus 50 years ago where it was more pushing your product.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, it's still the way it's practiced by most
Sure.
sellers. It's still pushing the product. Yeah, I mean, and this I think is really a critical thing. And I think we've been stuck in this mindset for so long about we're going to go persuade somebody to buy our product, is that we really lose track of the buyer in the whole thing. And it's the buyer, based on the study. Everybody's seen the studies. I presume most people have, from Gartner and others, saying, I think Gartner's number is 75% of B2B buyers, decision makers, don't want to talk to salespeople. And my take on that, which I like to say is, well, that's completely wrong. It's 100% of buyers don't want to talk to salespeople. But if you're a seller and you find yourself talking to a buyer, it's because they need to.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't need to talk to you, they wouldn't. So, what are you going to, if they need, what do they need from you? Well, they need your help. And this is, I differ with other people, is they don't need your help to buy something. They need your help to make a decision. And I think those are sort of a little bit different, right? And what the decision they're making is, are we going to make this change in our business? And that change is represented by buying this product or service that we're looking at. And if you can really focus on saying, well, yeah, I'm going to help the buyer make this decision to make a change, then you're sort of taking it from a different perspective as well. I've got this, I'm going to talk to them. I'm going to discover them. I'm going to qualify them. We're going to demo them. Blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, okay, well, if the buyer's looking at making a change in their business, what's sort of the pattern they're following? Well, the pattern they're following is, we need to sort of define the opportunity of what we want to achieve by making this change, right? And so we need to define the outcomes we want to achieve. We need to define sort of the challenges, internal hurdles we may have to make that change. And then once we've done that, then we'll go out in the market and say, okay, how can we make this change, right? What are the products or services available to help us make this change? And the last decision we make is who we're going to make the change with. Well, most salespeople come in and start pitching their product, right? Well, the buyer's in this mode of saying, look, I'm just trying to define what it is we're going to do. And that's why they're talking to you, because that's the help they need. But we're so out of line with that in the way that most sales organizations are set up their processes. You look at the stages in the CRM system. They don't align to this. Hey, we're trying to find what we're going to do. Then we're going to talk about how we're going to do it. And then the third thing we do is choose who to do it with. So challenge for us as sellers, I said, to maintain relevance is we really have to align ourselves exactly with what the buyer is going through. Right now, it sort of looks like there's two things that are going on. There's the seller's job and then there's the buyer's job. Well, there's really just one job that's happening. That's the buyer trying to make a decision. And we said we need to be much more closely aligned with that.
Yeah, I love that idea of the buyer being the hero of the story, as opposed to the seller or the company being the hero of the storyline. It's kind of switching. If you're creating a narrative or a storyline, it's the buyer that's like they're the ones that should be winning and the hero of this whole thing, this whole journey.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. We have this whole sort of, the tides crested a little bit, but in sort of 2018, 2019, 2021, so all this emphasis on storytelling, right? Especially in sort of the pandemic, is we got to tell stories, which is true. But I think most people missed the mark about what story we're supposed to be telling. And I think, Richie, you have that as we're telling the buyer's story. That's the only story they want to hear. They want to hear their story, how they're going to prosper as a result of making this change in their business. And the sellers were just not very good at sort of creating what I wrote about Sell Without Selling Out, this vision of what success looks like. And this is something that actually has to happen very early in the buyer's process of making the decision, because then that becomes the target at which all of your subsequent sales efforts and efforts to help the buyer are focused on. Let's reach agreement on what it is, what the success looks like, and then from that point we get a much better focused discussion about how we can help you.
So I want to just ask a few questions about your career. We'll kind of start.
Sure.
We're gonna, we've asked about this fictitious last sale, and now we're gonna kind of jump to the other end of the spectrum and talk about first sale and some other notable sales along the way that we have that we're curious about. But
sure.
I have a feeling that we're gonna hear how some of these themes developed in your career through some of these notable sales, and perhaps our listeners will have some good takeaways from these stories as well. So jumping into it, what's the first sale you ever remember making?
Oh, I remember. So I was working for my first job at college, working for a company called Burroughs. And Burroughs at the time was the second largest computer company in the world behind IBM. But that was before antitrust against IBM. And at that point, the next 7 companies combined were still just a small fraction of IBM's revenues. And so at the time in the industry, they called it IBM and the 7 dwarfs. So we were dwarf number 1. And in order to earn our stripes to go to training class to learn how to sell computer systems, Burroughs had this legacy product line of adding machines, desktop adding machines. So at the time, they were about the size of a small microwave oven and cost $200, $350 in those days, which, equivalent of $1,000+ these days. But that was when handheld calculators were just coming out, and they cost $50, $75, and that's what we were competing against. But we had to sell $5,000 worth of calculators, desktop adding machines, before they qualify to send us to computer training school. So, at that time, living in Oakland, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area, and my territory was the East Bay Area. And I would drive to business parks, and 8:30 in the morning, get kicked out of the office by the boss. We'd drive down to a business park the car, computer under one, or calculator under one arm, and a flip chart portfolio under the other, and just go door to door to door to door. And I hated it. But so I don't know, sometime after about a month doing it, because soon after I got hired, I got sent away for 2 weeks to initial sales training class, and then came back and go right on to territory. So it was a Friday afternoon. It was like one of the situations where I was completely frustrated, demoralized, and you convince yourself to make one more call. So I was actually in Fremont, California, South Bay, and there was a business called Buck's Welding. And I, sort of the tail end of this strip mall I've been cold calling on. So figure it's probably improbable, but went in, and you walk in this welding shop. I'd never been in a welding shop before. And the thing was, it was like walking into a room with no light source at all, because the soot was covered all the walls, and it was just completely dark in there. And it looked like this sort of one-man shop. And I got my nice, 3-piece dark suit, pinstripe, white shirt. and Buck was there. And Buck, I have no idea how old Buck was, because it was covered in soot from head to foot. Looked like those old pictures of coal miners. And I don't know, he must have just sensed that I needed something, because it was like, business like this needs to spend $350 on a desktop adding machine. But he was so nice. He said, "Oh, show me what you have." Right? Instead of just saying, "Get the hell out of here," he said, "Show me what you have." So he cleared a space on top of a workbench, and I went through my standard demonstration of this desktop adding machine. And he just blew me away, and he said, "Great, I'll take it." I was just like, "What?" So I think my first sale was maybe somewhat of a pity sale, and I thank Buck if that was the case. But yeah, that was the first one, and made for the start of this career.
An amazing career it is. Amazing career it still is.
Yeah, I hope so.
Let's go from the first sell to the biggest sell, and kind of the process of making the sell. I'm kind of curious, because you're talking about satellite communications, which sounds like it's really major, but it could be another deal in the computer systems. What would you say your biggest deal would be? Maybe the podcast.
No, and the the biggest sale is certainly computer and satellite communications networks. We got some interesting ones. I probably can't talk about all of them, but the last sort of real big one was with a company that was in the oil services business that wanted to have a network where they could transmit video images from the wellheads that they were drilling from around the world to their geologists who are centrally located in the United States, so they could look at the composition of what was coming back up and make decisions about drilling and so on. That was big. And, that was one where the size of the deal was so large that our company size was relatively small at that point, that, the potential revenue was a multiple of our own company revenues.
Mm-hmm.
So then customer said, "Well, you guys need to have a bigger company serve as prime contractor on this." So we were competing against Hughes Aerospace, Hughes Network Systems, which is part Hughes, obviously a multi-billion-dollar company, and that time I think our revenues were about $50 million a year. And so they basically matched us with a large defense contractor to be a prime contractor on the deal. And as we started, working through the process as a small company, our thing was always, how do we set the stakes of the competition, right? Instead of how do we change the buyer's paradigm for what they think they want to accomplish, because it's almost like sort of a challenger method, if you will, right? But how do we
Mhm.
get them to really shift? Because if we could do that, then we thought, okay, we had a chance to play on sort of more level playing field versus always playing by the big guys' rules, because then it becomes the price competition and so on. So we were able to, we had some ideas for some new implementation of satellite communications technology to help them save bandwidth and costs, and it was really critical for getting their buy-in pretty early. So they down selected into a handful of vendors. They're talking to two, which was us against Hughes, and um, yeah, we're pretty sure that we had the inside track on winning, but you can never be sure. And
Mhm.
so I'd been taught early on by my first boss. He said, "Look, you always want to be the third option, meaning that if it boils down to you and someone else, the way you increase your odds of winning is you always have two options you present to the buyer. So it then becomes a choice between them, you, and you." And that's what I did. So I did is I went out and found another large prime contractor, in this case, actually IBM, to also put in a bid using based on our technology. And I think that's what enabled us really to solidify the win, was that when the buyer looked at it, it wasn't just a choice between us versus the other guy. It was us versus the other guy versus another version of us that was
Yeah.
slightly different. And I think this is really a critical lesson that sellers really need to take to heart is, and I've done this throughout my entire career, is you never want to single thread your offer. Is even if you're selling a standard product, you need to find a way to package up at least two options, if not more, for the buyer to consider for your product or your service. And I said that's why I always call it the third option. And you want to be that third option. And if you do that, really it doesn't matter the size of opportunity you're working on, it will increase your odds of winning the deal.
It's
That's
interesting.
brilliant. That's brilliant.
Yeah, it's just
Yeah.
it's easy to it requires a little thought. If you have just a standard product, yeah, if we sell a SaaS software product, well, but you need to sit down with everyone in the within the product, and your sales manager and the CEO and so on, and say, well, yeah, what can we structure that's a little bit different option and a different alternative for us? And everybody talks about multi-threading, and we're talking to all the multiple decision makers. Sure, those people and sellers have been doing that, you know, since the beginning of selling. But this idea of saying, look, you're being more creative on how you present the options, because that really plays into the way people make decisions. There's been a fair amount of research into this, and generally, sort of sequential decision making is, people identify a problem, they identify options for, um, that could be a solution for the solutions, and they choose one. And there was, I don't know if you've ever read the book Decisive by the Heath brothers, a really interesting book, and in there they talk about research that had been done by this sort of pioneer in corporate decision making, a guy from Ohio State University, I think, not sure he's still alive, but formerly Ohio State, named Paul Nutt. And he found that when companies go through this process of identifying, defining the problem, creating options for that they want to present to management for approval, is that in the overwhelming majority of the case, I think it's like 97% of the case or something, is they only present two options to decision makers. And you can then start to see as well, gosh, what if you present three options, right? Um, that suddenly it starts changing the game. And so, this idea of creating multiple options, I think, is really, really powerful. And sellers, you could do it, whether it's delivery, implementation, terms. There's lots of things, that levers you can pull to make that happen.
You change your odds, right? I mean, you
Yeah.
were start off with 50-50 odds, you or the other or your competition. And then
Yeah.
by bringing another version of you to the table, now your odds are 2/3. You know, so
Yeah.
it's
Well, theoretically, right? But I think it's a larger point you bring up, which is really important, is that, again, this is the way I was taught and the way I learned and the way I've practiced it throughout my career is as sellers, we're in the probabilities business. Plain and simple, right? So part of our thought process around every action we take with a buyer should be, is this increasing my odds of winning the deal or not? And if what I'm going to deliver to you, if the question I'm going to ask, whatever that, if it's not going to do that, then why am I doing it?
very good point.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, focus on probabilities. Yeah, what's going to increase the probabilities of me winning? And I remember reading about professional poker player. I forget who it was that they interviewed, and he says, "Well, yeah, people think this is a game of chance, but it's a game of skill, right? There's a reason why the people are at the table at the World Series of Poker, or whatever, because it's not because the cards have fallen their way, because at each move they make, they're calculating the probabilities of winning based on the move." And I think in sales, a very similar situation is yeah, you have to be very intentional about every step you take. And again, one of the themes wrote about sell without selling out, and being intentional that, hey, this is going to increase my odds of winning.
So, what's an example of a sale where maybe the odds weren't in your favor? For whatever
All of them.
reason, it was the hardest, most stressful, like made you kind of rethink, like what's going on here? What was the sale that gray hair inducing, all of these types of thoughts and things that come to mind?
Yeah,
That what comes to mind there?
probably. Well, maybe a couple. One is one I lost, right? And which was such a lesson learned. A time was a company we were selling, radio stations were just beginning to use, and radio networks were just beginning to use digital distribution of programming to affiliates. And so the company I was with, we were one of the companies that was getting that business and providing that digital distribution via satellite. And yeah, we're competing for the distribution network for ABC radio. And it was pretty early in my career, but nonetheless, I should have known better, but I guess. But the lesson learned is we thought we had it, and we had validation to the point that from our stakeholders that, oh yeah, this is the solution we're going to recommend. Da 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 da. But it's a big enough deal, and this is the part we missed, where we didn't get enough face time with the CEO. And yeah, I don't believe that every product needs to be sold to the CEO, but this is one that did, and we did not have enough exposure to him, and we were competing against the incumbent, and they did. And despite everybody on the buying committee telling us we had it, we didn't get it. And yeah, that was stressful, having to explain to the board why we didn't get it. Yeah, it's just a misstep. It's a lesson learned, right? I think the lesson is for sellers is that, I think that, as I said before, is we overemphasize in general in sales that you need to get to the C-suite, because not every product, if you're selling a copier to a big company, it doesn't need to go to the C-suite. If you're selling, paper clips. And in my first book, I lay out this little grid that shows you how to sort of figure out how high within the organization you need to sell based on sort of the strategic nature of the product. Is the product sort of tactical on one end of the spectrum, or is it strategic? And strategics are defined by cost and complexity and risk. So, yeah, that was painful, and mostly the aftermath was painful, because so I had to go in front of the CEO and the board and explain why we didn't have a forecast that quarter, because we didn't get that deal. Um, there's another big deal is we're in a company. It was one that really enabled us to go public, and so we were selling to a large, one of the largest wireless service providers in Asia. And, they wanted to have this network of communications, satellite communications, sort of backbone communications for expanding cellular networks in Asia. And it's sort of an interesting story in that they'd originally asked us to bid on it, but we looked at the RFP and said, look, we're way too small to participate at that time in the company. We didn't have the resources. We couldn't have responded. I stayed in touch with the decision makers, and after about a year and a half, almost 2 years, they hadn't made a decision. So I contacted the guy again and I said, so what's happening? You haven't made a decision. He says, oh, we haven't, found something that can do what we want, but we're getting serious about it again because we need to do this from a business standpoint. So I said, well, hey, can we come in and get a shot at that? So yeah, CEO and I hopped on a plane, went to Hong Kong, sort of blew him away with this presentation about, because we had put a lot of thought in the intervening 2 years about what we were going to do and what we could do. But yeah, the stakes were pretty high because we knew this was going to be the deal. If we won, was going to enable the company to sort of take a step up, and sort of was driving our plans to go public as a company. So our big stress was we knew we had the best technical solution, the best business solution, but the size of the competitor was such we knew they could walk in any day and drop their prices 20% and take the business from us, and we couldn't respond to it. So yeah, that was pretty stressful as we sort of got to the last month or so, and before they said, okay, yeah, we're going to do a contract with you, is just living literally every day thinking that the competitor would come in and just steal it from us.
Wow. Yeah, that's
always tough.
Well, it spoke to a couple things. So what it spoke to is the level of trust that we had built and credibility we had built with the customer, even though we were smaller, even though we were unproven. And we certainly had some hiccups in the implementation, but they were patient with us because the vision of what we created together, of what they could achieve, was not one the competitor could match. So yeah, they may have been able to buy it at some point, ultimately less expensively. And I'm sure the competitor offered the huge discounts, but they chose not to take it because they had more trust that we could deliver what they wanted. And that is such a critical thing that people just underestimate all the time. It's end of the day, it's not about your product. If you assume that having a competitive product at a competitive price is table stakes, your ability to win the deal is based on the connections you've made and the way you've differentiated yourself at the human level, and the way you help the buyer make that decision, not the product and the price.
It is all about that. All about making those decisions. So that's stressful, missed deal, stressful deal. Do you ever get in slumps? Or sometimes you just get out of bed and you're like, you know what? Can I still make the sales that I need to make? Do I still have the it factor? I suppose.
The it factor.
I think we all go through slumps, and if you're feeling down or slumpy, I guess, is there something that you do to turn your mind around and get out of it?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not really conscious of having been in slumps per se. There are situations you find yourself in that are more challenging than others, and so I think it's more, for me, a case of, okay, trying to figure out, well, what is the situation I'm in, and being really pragmatic with yourself about
Mm-hmm.
What's going on that's causing it, and it could be, oftentimes it's external, right? Is I think people don't pay enough attention to the impact of things that are going on in their life outside of work that have an impact on their ability to sell. Because again, we're in this human business, and
Mm-hmm.
people are forming perceptions of us based on how we come across. And if your mind is distracted by things that are happening outside of work, yeah, it can have a real impact on you. And you really have to be, I said, pragmatic and self-actualized, but I may use that term to a degree that you can take a step back and say, yeah, this is having an impact. So, in my case, yeah, went through some marriage issues and these marital issues, yeah, definitely had an impact. And I think over a period of 6-9 months, I could sort of see that my performance was just not the level it needed to be at. And so, yeah, to me, it's more of those type situations
Yeah.
than, hey, I lost my mojo, whatever, right?
Mm.
It's more the external. And I see it in people I've managed and worked with and so on is yeah, sure, there are frustrations in the job and those can build and they can, play a role. But I'd say more often than not, when somebody's really struggling, is I always start with what's happening outside of work.
Yeah, it
Good
makes me
place to
think.
look most of the time.
Yeah. I mean, sure, it could be a boss. I mean, one time I worked for a boss that was just intolerable and had to had to get out of the situation because the person was literally insane. But yeah, more often than not, it's been other things.
Yeah.
It makes me think back to when I was playing baseball. One of the best managers I played for was Rick Renneria, who went on
Mm-hmm.
to manage the Cubs and then the White Sox. And I'm mad at the city of Chicago for both of those teams letting him go because he was just such an amazing guy. But yeah, he knew what was happening in everybody's life outside the field as well. And I
Yeah.
feel like it's probably for exactly what you're talking about because he knew that life is life. Like people, there's this saying of like, oh, he's the nicest guy off the field, but he's an absolute monster on the field. And it's like, well, Mikey over here doesn't stop being Mikey when he steps onto the baseball field. Like that's also part of his life and who he is.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of crossover in that. So yeah, that resonates quite a bit. Um, Kind of a two-part question here.
Sure.
What is the sale that you are, regardless of the size of the sale or how much money was involved, what's the sale that you're most proud of? And is there a sale that comes to mind that you're least proud of, where you're like, man, I wish I could have done some things differently, or I'm not super satisfied with how this went down? So is it the most proud of sale? You're like, man, I feel great about this. And then there's this other sale that you wish you might could do over again or do differently.
Um. Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, the least proud are the ones you lose, right? For reasons that were avoidable, as like I described. Most proud. Yeah, I think one of the things that, and you talked about sales that maybe informed or reflected, my vision of selling and the importance of certain things that of the human side of things is so. Company I was with, we were uh, negotiating a deal to sell the first real-time satellite delivered entertainment system to commercial airplanes. Right, so this was well before Wi-Fi and all these other things. This was real-time radio delivered to the seat back, and so at the time there were no screens. This audio, video was going to come a few years after that, a number of years after that. But we were working this Fortune 5,000 or 500, actually a Fortune 50 firm, who was sponsoring this network, and so I was back on the East Coast with the guy that worked with me. We were negotiating the final contract. And so I was sitting across the table from the senior VP of this Fortune 50 company, and some of his people were staff members and myself. And the first day, we made pretty good progress. We had planned to be there about 3 days to finish the contract. So at the end of the first day, I got a call from headquarters back on the West Coast. That's one of the co-founders of the company saying, how are the negotiations going? Good. Yeah, I think, we're a day away maybe from, oh, great. He says, we've got a bit of a problem. So, oh, really? What would that be? He said, well, we were just reviewing all the spreadsheets that we had put together to calculate the costs of doing the project. The project had two parts. One is they were paying us to develop the product, and then they were going to buy a certain number of units. And they said, yeah, there was a mistake on the spreadsheet, and we're going to have to change our prices. That's all. That's sort of a problem. We're in the midst of the contract negotiations. We've pretty much agreed on those. He says, yeah. He says, yeah, we're going to have to make the change. Otherwise, we're just going to pull out of the deal. I said, okay, well, what are we talking about? We're off by about half. I'm like, so what you're saying is that we have to double our prices? He said, yeah. Otherwise, it's just, we're not going to make any money. And the CEO, that's already put his foot down. And if we can't get at least a certain amount, which turned out to be a little bit less than twice, but still. So I had, it was at the end of the day, I had to go back into this conference room to this, senior VP of this large enterprise and say, we've got a bit of a problem. And it may not surprise you here, is the person he completely lost it. I've never been yelled at like that, accused of being, all the worst things in the world, bait and switch, blah, blah, blah. This went on and on and on. And then they had security escort us from the building.
Wow.
2 days later, we got the deal signed at the price we needed. And, the lesson there was that we had built up a tremendous amount of trust and credibility to the point where we could sit down with them and explain that the error was not, we're not trying to deceive them. It was not one of intention. It was purely been a mistake. Apologized. Yeah, we made a couple other concessions relative to, helping me expedite the project and so on. But, basically 2 days later, signed the deal for almost double the price of what we originally had bid. It was not fun by any stretch of imagination, but it showed the power of the connections that you make with people, the relationships. And there's such a sort of this almost fear of using the word relationships in sales in the last 5-10 years or so. It's like, oh, it's not about relationships. Buyers don't want to be friends. And it's like, well, sure, trust me, these people weren't my friends. But we had this trust-based relationship that existed. We had the credibility. We were completely, I thought we were being transparent up to it, but we became even more transparent afterwards. We had to be, to show them, where the error happened and why, and at a level of detail that they understood that this was not, a bait and switch. But absent those relationships, absent having invested in building those, we would have been done. The deal would have been done, just off the table altogether. And we weren't competing against anybody. We were the only one that really had the capabilities of doing this at that point in time. So it was strategic both for us as a company and as well as for, the customer.
It's one of the themes in your lessons learned bits after your story is it's all about those relationships. It's all about the trust and credibility that you can provide or that you make, right?
Yeah, well, that you build, and it's a process, but you have to do it intentionally because you know that it's important. And I think that's part of what I really learned in my career that a lot of sellers don't have the value or the benefit of is, when you're always working for small companies who are selling big things, right? I mean, there's a lot of startups out there, especially in the SaaS world. They're selling the software, and it's relative the value of SaaS, the SaaS models, right? It's not a big purchase up front. You can grow into it. You can start really small. A lot of value in that. But the sellers don't learn how to sell big. And when you do that, you begin to understand, that trust really is important. If somebody's signing up for, $10K a month for, a subscription to a SaaS product, the risk profile is pretty low, right? For the decision maker. Not that it's completely absent because I can't always make bad decisions, but when it's, millions and millions of dollars, when it's a strategic initiative for the company, because, they're getting into a new business, which oftentimes that's how companies used our products, is get into, new businesses to expand their revenue, market share, whatever. It becomes very different. And again, another company we were talking to, one of the largest companies in the world at that time. They want us to build a product for one of their divisions. And been working the deal for about a year, and it got to the point where it's time to bring the CEO of my company to meet the CEO of this division of this. I said one of the 10 largest companies in the world at that point. And bring them in. They were a great meeting. I think it was really positive. As we're walking out, my CEO turns to me and said, "No way we're getting that deal." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, they're going to pay us to develop this product, and they have on payroll more engineers than we have than we have employees in our company. People they're paying week after week to develop products like this. There's no way they're going to give us this." I said, "No, you're missing the point. They are going to give it to us because they trust us more than they trust the people internally to deliver the product they need."
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we got the deal. But yeah, we didn't have a paper. Our product was purely on paper, right? We weren't showing anything. But that's what we did as a company. It wasn't just me. It was, everybody that, interacted with the customer was part of building that trust and that credibility. And we were very deliberate about establishing multiple touch points across our organization, across into the customer's organization. But that was it. It was the relationships, the connections. People don't like the idea of relationships, and say the connections we built. And they were trust-based connection, credibility-based. And yeah, every time I read, and you haven't seen as much the last year or two, but a couple of years ago, like in the early days of the pandemic, it was loud voices sort of downplaying this idea of relationships and so on. And they were just, I was vocal and just saying these people are just flat out wrong. We're in a business of a human business. As long as you're a human talking to a human, this is going to be important.
Yep. Yeah. Couldn't agree more. The human element of things is never going to go away. So last question here, and I'm kind of wrapping two questions into one again. But
I don't think it's going to go away. But I think, as I mentioned before, I think just the number of products that require human sellers to work with human buyers is continuing to shrink. I mean, it's still a vast number of products, but it's inevitable that we grow more and more comfortable through the use of technology, and AI certainly could help this is buying things of greater complexity and cost without human intervention. And that trend's going to continue, but it's I said, the number of products that still require the human is still very, very large. We're not going to see, there's, I don't know if you remember back in 2014, 2015, Forrester put out a report saying some large fraction of B2B sellers would be gone by the year 2020. Instead, what we saw is a net growth in B2B sales employment over that period of time. So humans aren't going away yet, but
they're not going away yet. AI is probably going to help humans sell.
Could
right?
If you use it correctly.
Yeah, could. But I think buying is always an emotional decision, and there's logic involved, but it's emotion based in a lot of ways, and you need help in making that decision. And a good salesperson is the person who's going to be helping in that decision.
Yeah, sellers need to keep in mind, if the buyer's talking to you, it's not because they want to, it's because they need to. So you need to understand what help they need from you that's motivating them to want to talk to you.
Well, Andy, it's been a pleasure talking to you here on The Last Sell, our new podcast, and really appreciate you coming on and sharing your sales stories with us.
Oh, well, Kevin, thanks for having me. And yeah, congratulations on your new podcast. Excited to see how it turns out for you. And yeah, you guys did a great job. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. And for our listeners, where can they find your new podcast?
Wherever you listen to podcasts. So it's the Win Rate Podcast. And yeah, 2024, we're going to be making some exciting additions to it, and going to multiple episodes per week. So yeah, we're very excited.
Perfect. Thank you once again.
Thank you.